So at this time, our speaker is available to answer your questions and comments. I would ask that you please submit your questions using the chat feature in WebEx. Questions are being compiled, and Jonathan will address as many as time allows. So what I'm going to do is when the questions come in, I will read them out loud so that Jonathan can respond. But in the meantime, as we're waiting for folks to submit their questions, I want to ask Jonathan, you, as just like the other grantees, all have community partners as part of our cumulative risk grants. And I was kind of curious about how has your community partner reacted to this modeling approach that you've developed to basically describe their community using models?
It's a good question. I mean, I think they were certainly intrigued by it. You know, the details of doing, you know, a synthetic microdata, you know, were not really of interest to them, but of understanding the geography of things and the demographics of things was quite important, because then you could really do targeted outreach efforts. And so when we talked about the concept of doing an analysis that was very specific to New Bedford rather than using generic information, they were quite interested, and it was really, you know, the idea of the community to then take that context and information and to start to build up this community survey and implement the community survey so that we could really be able to link things to present time. So they really, you know, were, again, intrigued by it, and then really kept us focused on, you know, building models that were relevant to people's everyday lives and to the risk reductions that they could potentially implement, and to recognizing that, again, explaining what had happened in 1995 was less relevant to people than explaining what is happening in 2013. And so making sure that we built our models in a way that informs the present and the future rather than the past.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. I have a question for you sort of along the lines about communicating your results. The comment and the question, you note the models are not derived from geodata. Did you try other graphics than maps for showing differences and model fit? If so, how do you think it would communicate to the public compared to it, you know, using the maps?
Yeah, and if I understand the question, there's sort of a couple dimensions there. You know, one is, you know, was our only form of kind of validating and comparing just the geography? And the short answer is no. It was a convenient metric to look across the census tracts and make sure we represented that, but we also looked at across, you know, income, education, you know, race, ethnicity, country of origin, a lot of these core variables to see if we were representing the information correctly, and then more importantly, if there were, you know, gradients in exposure across those demographic groups. And as I alluded to earlier, I think it's our strong sense that, you know, while it's tempting to map these things out, that in fact the maps have the potential to be misleading. I showed them there because it is a quick means of communicating things in a 30-minute seminar. But for our broad community outreach, we sort of agreed internally that mapping is not the most appropriate way to do things, and that we really do want to highlight, you know, perhaps demographics, but more broadly, you know, exposure pathways that may be relevant and may be modifiable. So I think, you know, these graphics certainly might be included in some outreach materials, but I think it's not going to be the centerpiece, and many of the maps, I think, would not be part of our broad outreach strategy.
Well, that's a good segue into this next question. This person said the 4 maps actually looked pretty different to them regarding the highest impacted areas. And the question is, are you working on, I guess, developing joint stressor models?
Yeah, that's where we're heading, and that's the goal of the structural equation modeling, is to link these stressors jointly with the health outcome of interest, and that will give us a sense of their relative risks and allow us to provide, you know, weighting schemes that are risk relevant or direct, you know, population attributable risk type calculations. So eventually where we would get to is a single map or table or whatever the vehicle is for presenting it that cuts across all the stressors and gives a sense of the highest risk subpopulation. So where we're heading. And I think, just as a side point, the fact that the maps are different from one another is, I think, somewhat expected and a good thing. I think it would be fairly unlikely that the exact same geographic areas would be high risk for exposure for everything, simply because there are demographic subtleties in the population that, lead to differences in patterns. Certain ethnic groups tend to have certain food consumption patterns, but they're not the same ones that are high smokers. So, other, fish consumption has a more complex demographic patterning, because sometimes there's elevated fish consumption with higher income. And so part of the point of looking at multiple stressors in this way is to reflect the fact that they're going to be differently patterned, and then eventually to pull them together to get a sense of the joint health risks.
Excellent, thank you. Another question we have, how much is your model extendable to other cities?
I think the approach is extendable to other cities. I think the model itself, I would be cautious in extending it to other cities, simply because there's a lot of local population nuances that could mean that certain behaviors or certain, especially demographic variables, seem indicative of exposures, and it just wouldn't represent elsewhere. And our hope is certainly if we had more variables that were about exposure pathways, that would enhance the generalizability. But even in that, a fish consumption variable, even on a specific type of fish, PCB levels in fish consumed in New Bedford may not be the same as PCB levels of fish consumed in Chicago or Los Angeles or other places. So I would think that, for a 0th order estimate, you could be okay, but it's probably much more reliable to use local validation data, or data that is at least within the same general geographic region.
I have another question for you regarding the use of publicly available data sets. I think you are correct in that folks will need to look at creative ways of making use of that information. But I'm wondering, based on your experience, are there any lessons learned from your use of publicly available data that you could share with the audience? I mean, what are some caveats, what are some issues you ran across, or advice you might provide to others?
It's a good question. I mean, I think one of the central issues is just, wrestling with getting the multivariate data versus the geography. And I think in the census, we were able to deal with that reasonably well with this synthetic simulation approach. But, for example, working with NHANES data, the amount of geographic information you can get is fairly limited, and BRFSS is a little bit better in the geography that you can get, but there are still constraints. So I think there are a lot of excellent public data resources that have really a lot of richness in exposure variables and other stressors and in outcome variables, but where geography is masked, and at times is masked to a level that is very, very high, difficulty in even getting things at the regional level. So I think that has certainly been a difficulty, simply because associations between exposures and outcomes may not be geographically consistent, and it's good to have as much geographically refined information as possible. But I think our experience with the census data and the simulation approach was quite positive, and I think the data are readily available, the methods worked well, and even I didn't mention some of the details of the model fitting, but in fact we originally went into the modeling figuring that there's no way that we could fit it to all these 13 constraints, and we were going to have a more complex process to figure out the subset that we could reasonably apply, and then we applied the maximum set, and it worked great on the first go-around. So we were very enthused that the simulation does give you a chance to really map out these data in very good detail.
Great. I have another question for you. Which or how many fields from the census data were used to generate the microdata, for example, for predicting smokel incidence rates or prevalence rates?
Yeah, so the constraint set is one set of information. So those are the fields that we use to basically create the synthetic microdata, and that was I think, as I said, 8 individual fields and 5 household fields. But once you create that linkage, you basically get every field that exists in the microdata from the census, which is, I don't know how many offhand, but dozens upon dozens, if not hundreds upon hundreds. So every question that exists in the American Community Survey carries along with the microdata, and so we have a very large multivariate data set, and only a subset were used in building the smoking model and in some of the other model building, but we do have a host of additional information related to housing type and housing structure and commuting patterns and a lot of other information that goes well beyond what we can probably fold into this analysis, but which could provide a lot of interesting information with good granularity for future studies in New Bedford.
Thank you. I have another question for you. It's really intriguing how you apply this microdata approach, and you had mentioned this is something that is used in marketing. And I was just kind of wondering if you could share with us, how did you come about thinking about this methodology?
Luck is sometimes an important thing, and when we were starting to try to figure out how to build these models, we had tried a few strategies that were not successful, and then I suddenly recalled that about 20 years ago when I was working in management consulting, I'd actually been involved in a micro-marketing project where we tried to simulate census data, and our methods were incredibly cursory, and the computational power was a whole lot worse then than it is now, so we couldn't do very much, but there was that nugget of an idea that you could simulate data from the census that they didn't report, and then that led us to drill down into the literature and uncover some of these researchers who have really built up these methods, again, in part in the marketing and probably even more in the demography field. So it was one of those sort of happy coincidences of life that allowed us to really take some interesting methods that others had worked hard to develop and apply it in a new space.
I'm wondering if there are probably some other examples of learning from other disciplines and other activities that could be really informative to human health, public health, exposure, risk assessment. So it's really exciting to see that you're applying methodology that has been used elsewhere. I want to see if Lawrence had any comments or questions he wanted to pose. Any other questions? People, if you want to submit one more question, we have a few more minutes. Lawrence, I'm not sure if I just turned to you to see if you had any comments you wanted to share or question for Jonathan.
No direct questions to the methodology. It's sufficiently new to me that I really don't have the background skill to ask you any academic questions about it. But I am curious to get your sense. Do you feel that this kind of an application would receive serious consideration, say, I don't want to put it in terms of a legal case, but if we were looking at a situation in a community, as you were in New Bedford, and the community was looking for cause and effect, and we're looking across multiple stressors, what degree of certainty do you think that you could bring with a methodology like this? Maybe certainty is not the right word for it, but
it's a good question, and I'd be the first to say, I mean, there's appreciable uncertainty here and appreciable unexplained variability, and I think this gets us in the direction of understanding subpopulations that are more highly exposed to individual or multiple contaminants, but it's clearly some distance removed from what you would need for, say, an epidemiologic investigation or something where you would have a lot of confidence in an individual level exposure characterization. Again, we ideally were trying to build things that tied to exposure pathways, but a fair amount, just because of the limited information, had to be about demographics that were broadly representing a whole host of different things, current behaviors, cumulative lifetime exposures, socioeconomic factors, and so on. And so I think, I would provide a fair amount of caution before using it in a, something that was, approaching an epidemiologic investigation. I think we really approach this by thinking of what's the counterfactual, meaning, in the absence of models like this, we would basically just have to assume everyone in New Bedford has some mean exposure to a contaminant, or that there be some modest differences across basic information. And this allows us to capture those who are likely to be more highly exposed versus those who are less likely to be highly exposed. But there's a fair amount of unexplained variability and a fair amount of uncertainty in those determinations.
So it is more reasonably thought of as a screening strategy, perhaps.
Yeah, or I would say it as probably one of the only viable ways to do cumulative risk assessment in this manner at a community scale, which I think by necessity has to be more like a screening level assessment. So maybe an indirect way of saying yes, but just trying to reinforce that it's hard to think of ways to get much more refined individual level data for a community short of a very large scale, multi-year surveillance study that's, well beyond what just about any risk assessment could do.
Thanks.
And I have one more question before we close out. The speaker mentioned the potential of misunderstanding the color maps as area impact rather than potential impact to the characteristics of the population within that area. The question is, have the results of the study been released yet to the public? If so, how are the results being described in the press release or community meeting?
Yeah, they have not yet been released to the public. The work, these analyses have been completed, but they're not yet through the peer review process. We have shown all of these certainly to our community partner to gauge their reactions, and I think they were the ones who helped us to sort through these questions of the most appropriate form of presentation, and where we concluded that as this rolls out, we're going to want to at least supplement these graphs with tables and with caveats. And just to say, to be clear, I wouldn't be a proponent of saying some information should be presented in a forum like this and other information should be presented at a community setting. So we want to be transparent and provide the same type of information in all contexts. But we really are recognizing, I think, the importance of being cautious in the form in which the information is presented, or at the very least showing data in multiple ways and making sure that any information such as a map that's presented is in a presentation format, not just a handout, for example, or something where people could take a static image and misinterpret it out of context.
Jonathan, I just want to comment, as you were describing that interaction, I think really what you've just provided is a really good example of how you're engaging with your community partner in your research, getting that feedback from them about the results of your study, about how the information can be presented and interpreted. So I think what you've just stated is really informative for other people who are doing maybe similar work. And I would suggest it'd be great if you sort of, as you're moving along in your STAR grant, to continue to kind of capture that information, because I think the experience that you'll have will be probably really informative for others who are doing community-engaged research. Well, with that, I think we're going to close out the webinar. I want to thank everybody for their questions, and I want to say thank you again to Jonathan for his presentation today. If we can go to that final slide there, yes. Our next webinar will be held Wednesday, May 22nd at 3 p.m. Eastern, and will feature a presentation by one of EPA's very own scientists, Dr. Glenn Suter, who is the Science Advisor at the National Center for Environmental Assessment, and the title for his presentation is Why and How to Integrate Your Assessment, and I'm hoping he's going to be touching on issues around ecological risk assessment. Also, as a reminder, you will be receiving an email invitation to complete the online survey about today's webinar. Your feedback provides us with valuable insight into logistics improvement, potential discussion topics, and continuing to ensure our webinars best fit your informational needs. Once again, thank you for your time and participation. Have a great afternoon. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.